This video is about smart contracts, and I'd like to visualize what smart contracts look like on a blockchain. And visualizing it, I think, will help me think through some of the issues related to smart contracts. So to begin with, we need to visualize our blockchain. Let's use the Ethereum blockchain because Ethereum works really well with smart contracts, even though other blockchains can do the same thing. The Ethereum blockchain is sometimes described as a public, global, immutable computer. So you can walk up to it and type anything you want on there and hit save, and it will be saved forever. The contract example that I'm going to use in this video is a power tool contract. So here's the situation. Mr. Weasley went out and bought a bunch of power tools on a compulsive spending spree. And quite frankly, he hardly ever uses them. They just kind of sit there in his garage. So Mrs. Weasley started to get into these arguments with Mr. Weasley about buying all those power tools. Well, their daughter Ginny got a little bit tired of all this fighting, so she recommended that they make a little bit of extra money by renting out the power tools to their neighbors. So Mr. Weasley wrote up a note and taped it onto his garage. And the note said, "You can rent my power tools for $15. You just have to give me a deposit of $100, but I'll return that to you when you return the power tool. Just knock on the front door." And this was nice, and it started to make Mrs. Weasley a little bit less annoyed about the power tools. But then Mrs. Weasley started to get annoyed that people were constantly knocking on her door, interrupting her day, asking about the power tools. So Ginny came up with a new idea to help the situation. It turns out that Ginny Weasley had heard about this Ethereum thing, this global, public, immutable computer. So Ginny explains to Mr. Weasley that he can automate this contract. In other words, people can put in their credit card information and it will automatically charge them $115. And at that same very moment, the lock on his toolbox will automatically open for them. So Mrs. Weasley would never even have to answer the doorbell about the tools. Cool situation, right? And you might be thinking, wait a second, the smart contract thing sounds a little bit like a plain vanilla phone app. Why do you need to put this onto a blockchain? Okay, yeah, sure. This is more or less like a phone app. But actually, most of the applications built on top of the Ethereum blockchain are pretty similar to phone apps. You can think of them like that a little bit. And by the way, when people use the phrase built on top of the blockchain, that basically just means they walked up to the Ethereum computer, typed in their contract, and hit the save button. And I mean, I'm exaggerating a little bit here, but I'm trying to make things visualizable. So this smart contract that Ginny wants to write up is more or less just like a phone app. So why doesn't she just suggest to her dad to make a phone app? Why does she need the blockchain? Well, we're talking about Mr. Weasley here. And when he thinks about starting his own business and everything that would entail, he gets a little bit overwhelmed. I mean, he's fine with taping a note on his garage door and running his own little business in that way. That's not really a serious business, if you know what I mean. But starting his own real business, that's a little much. For one, Mr. Weasley would need to buy servers if he wanted to have his own business that was a phone app business. He'd also need to do the accounting, and this would make his taxes really complicated, and he might need to hire other kinds of workers for things that he's not trained or qualified to do, like legal fees, and it's just a little bit more complicated than Mr. Weasley is prepared for. If Ginny suggested all that, Mr. Weasley would just say, "Forget about it, your mother isn't that annoyed about the doorbell." And Ginny knows her dad's not up for that. However, if you just write this little bit of code onto the Ethereum computer / blockchain, you don't even need a server. Instead of having a server of your own, you can just buy the computing power that you need to execute one smart contract at a time. Here's how it works. When Ginny walks up to that computer that's the Ethereum blockchain essentially, she wants to type in her smart contract. And it just so happens that there's a guy standing next to the computer, and he wants to make a deal with her. He says he'll give her the computing power she needs to execute her smart contract once in exchange for 1 coin of Ether. And Ether is this cryptocurrency that you use to buy gas. Gas is what they call the computing power that you need to execute your contracts on the Ethereum blockchain. But then Ginny has a conversation with this guy next to the computer, and they figure out that she can build into the contract she's writing up, which is a little bit like a phone app, For any transaction that happens, instead of charging the $115 that we've talked about, she charges $115 plus whatever small charge they need to execute the contract in terms of the computing power. And it's really a small fee. So, putting Mr. Weasley's little smart contract onto the Ethereum blockchain is actually way simpler than having Mr. Weasley start his own business from scratch. Another cool thing about having this on a public global computer is that other people can steal Ginny Weasley's computer code. Ginny wrote up her code to help her dad's business, of course, but it turns out that there's men all over the world who buy power tools compulsively. And now any of them can simply copy and paste Ginny's computer code to start their own identical business. They just change the address from Mr. Weasley's address in the UK to their own address in Bangladesh or the US, and suddenly they have their own business. As an altruistic person, Ginny actually feels pretty good about writing up this computer code for the whole world to enjoy, not just her dad. But we do need to acknowledge that sometimes problems still happen with Mr. Weasley's business. The biggest problem happens when people return power tools in bad condition, in which case Mr. Weasley doesn't return their full refund, right? He doesn't return the $100 in full. And when this happens, there are occasions when people get mad at Mr. Weasley and yell at him. And this just wears Mr. Weasley down. Like, if he's had a customer yell at him, it just makes his whole day just exhausting. Luckily, Ginny Weasley has read Kevin Werbach's book, Blockchain and the New Architecture of Trust, so she knows that you can build an arbiter into a smart contract. Here's how it works. Before people hit the I agree button on Mr. Weasley's power tool contract, they have to specify a neutral person who will arbitrate between them and Mr. Weasley if there's any kind of disagreement about what condition the power tools are in when they return them. And Mr. Weasley has a list of like 1,000 arbiters that he would be okay with, he thinks are neutral. And some of these are really good arbiters. They're actually like lawyers who do this for a living. And it's really nice to have an arbiter make that decision instead of getting into a yelling match. So blockchain could actually possibly even be good for lawyers. Who would have thought? In any case, I hope you think smart contracts are as cool as I do. And I also hope you have some suspicions about them, and maybe even some suspicions about blockchain as a technology, because we're going to be exploring that in this video series. And so subscribe if you're still curious. I also feel like any video on smart contracts and blockchain needs to pay homage to Vitalik Buterin, who invented this idea at the age of 19. And he founded the Ethereum blockchain. That's such a good origin story. If you're going to start a new religion like blockchain, you need a good origin story, or it's just not going to work out. So it's no surprise that the two biggest cryptocurrencies out there both have a pretty cool origin story, one of them with a teenage inventor and the other with a completely anonymous inventor. Finally, my goal in this video series is to make blockchain visualizable. And I recognize and acknowledge that in doing so, I might make some overly goofy analogies and possibly even some bad analogies. So, I welcome comments that challenge my vision of things and that just keep the conversation going. I may not be able to respond immediately because I have a job teaching economics, but I do want this to be a conversation, and I'm learning alongside you, so I do want your thoughts on these matters.